the strong influences on my early life was superheroes. We lived in a world, I guess at that age, being very young, of dualistic world of good and bad, right and wrong, good and evil, who's in, who's out. And on the TV, I just love watching the old black and white TV in the corner, Superman and Batman and Robin, and I mean later there were the Marvel comic book heroes who came to life on TV screens, and then in colour TV in colour and on the theatre screens and so on. But the stories were really about the world was divided into the good and the bad, and the bad were a minority, and they threatened the general population, threatened the well-being of people. And it got to the point where they were about to dominate and take over, and the goodies would come in, either they were called in or they would notice the issue and they would come in and save the day. It wasn't straightforward. They would come in with superpowers or skills or resources, whatever they had, and there would be a battle and they would be overwhelmed for a while, and then they would somehow break through and save the day, and all would be well. But the only way to overwhelm the baddies who perpetrated evil and violence on the population was to use more violence. The only way the baddies could be overcome was through violence and more strength. Violence overcame violence. That was the message. It's a message that our world's lived by for millennia. It's a message that is an everyday story in our world. When someone is stronger and they threaten us, we have to come back with something stronger to overwhelm them, and they come back with something stronger, and it just goes on and on. At the same time, growing up in the 60s with the superheroes in the background and that kind of storyline, I was given a children's Bible at the time by my parents, and back then the children's Bible was nothing like what it was today. And the pictures were plates, were traditional art scenes of various stories in the Bible. There was Noah and the Ark and Moses stories and King David and Goliath, David and Goliath fighting, this boy and this giant. There's also a story about Jericho, the city of Jericho, where the people, the Israelite people that had become a nation, they were slaves in Egypt and they were released, came out and made this progression to the promised land. But in order to get there, they had to go through Jericho. And the story is really interesting in that they march around the city and sing and cry out. And on the seventh day they march 7 times and blow trumpets and sing and shout out, and the walls come tumbling down. But that story is filled with violence and genocide and murder and killing, because when the walls come down, instead of engaging with the people, the Israelite armies came in and smite the whole place and destroyed the town, the city. So much so that it was then cursed. Anyone who builds this city, rebuilds this city, will be cursed. And people did try to build it, and in order to overcome the curse, they sacrificed their own children to do it. And the city foundations were built on the bones of their children. This is a pattern and a story that the Israelites take this violence and genocide and violent way in the world into the promised land. The stories they tell of God are almost like the stories I heard in the superheroes, that when the baddies in the world, who are people who are different, who believe different things, think different things, look differently, live in a different place, threaten us or come up against us, and we feel threatened or fearful, we call on this superhero God who will come in and smite them and cleanse them and get rid of them. And I think Jesus sometimes is turned into a superhero who's going to smite the enemy and keep us safe and protect us from everything we fear or hate or dislike. And yet that's not the story that I read beneath the story in the Old and the New Testament, and particularly the story that Jesus teaches us. And these Israelites take violence and genocide and their violent ways into the promised land. It becomes a way of life, and constantly it undoes them, and someone's got to bring them back to a true way, and then they fall again, and that is a pattern of humanity. In this, we've been following Jesus moving, or Mark's story of Jesus, where as he moves to Jerusalem, chapters 8 to 10 of Mark's story, and in it he's moving to his death, and he tells the disciples and followers 3 times, I'm going there and I will die, I'll be put to death and rise again on the 3rd day. And they don't get it, they don't quite understand it, some get a bit of it. Anyway, this story is bounded by 2 healing stories, 2 men who are blind, who are healed. The first one, it's a 2-stage process. He's touched and prayed for, but he sees blurry. His sight in vision is blurred. He needs to more healing in order to see fully. The second one, and this for Mark is a point of saying you need to look deeply. At first you may see and hear what Jesus says, but it might be blurred. You need to look more deeply into the story and keep looking till you can see clearly. And he invites us to see in these stories this alternate way of Jesus in the world. The last story, which we come to this week, in the end of chapter 10, is another blind man, Bartimaeus. He's a beggar by the side of the road. He can't see, he's got a beggar's cloak. And his role in life is to sit there and beg and remind people in that sense of their duty to help the poor and the outcast and the marginalised. He does that. When he hears that Jesus of Nazareth is coming, he cries out, Jesus, Son of David, save me. And his role is to be quiet, not to speak out, not to say anything, but he keeps calling out, and the people around him, disciples and others, try and quieten him down, keep him silenced. Silence him, as we do those who are different, those who are on the edges, those who are marginalised, those who are poor, those who are being wronged. We try and silence. We don't want them upsetting the main game. And so they try and silence him, but he just calls out all the more. He's calling out for another way. You don't understand. This guy might. And he calls out. And Jesus hears him and says, look, bring him over. He throws off his beggar's cloak, his only possession. He throws off all he has, if you like. He throws off the thing that defines him as a beggar, as an outcast. And he runs in whatever way he does to Jesus. What do you want? I want to be healed. I want to see. And Jesus says, your faith has made you well. Go. But he follows Jesus on the way, we're told. And in this beautiful little story, what we're hearing is this guy who is blind sees. He sees through what's happening, and he sees into this one Jesus and knows that he is the one of God who offers a different way, a way for the marginalised people to find life, a way for him into new life, back into the community, to be accepted and acceptable. He throws away his beggar's coat. He does what the rich man earlier in chapter 10 can't do. He gives away everything he has to follow Jesus. The rich man goes away sad because he can't do that. This man sees what those with eyesight don't see. And the point Mark's making is you've got to open your eyes and look. And you might even have to go to the margins. You might have to go to the people who are on the margins, or you might have to go to the margins in order to see, in order to learn how to see, in order to hear the cries of the poor, to hear the cries of those on the bottom, to hear what God hears, to hear what Jesus hears, to go where Jesus went, and to find the life that he promises in those places. Jericho is mentioned in this story because Jesus is at Jericho. For Mark, naming these places is not accidental or incidental. It's theological, purposeful. It's not just Jericho, a physical place, but the metaphorical Jericho. The people of Israel had to go through Jericho to get to Jerusalem. And Joshua led them. Jeshua in the Hebrew led them. Jeshua means God saves. Led them, but led them in the way of violence. And they kept that violence up. They took it with them. In this story, a new Joshua or Jeshua, Jesus, Hebrew Jeshua, God saves, leads the story into Jerusalem via Jericho. He goes there again, but this time he doesn't come with violence. He comes with healing. He doesn't come with power and might, but he comes and meets the outcast, the lowly, the poor blind man on the side of the road, and brings healing. And he goes from Jericho into Jerusalem, not in power and might, as people would hoped and dreamed of. He goes vulnerably and humbly. He goes knowing that he will die, that the only way into life is through death. Through dying and letting go of the power and the might and the wealth and the strength and all those things that control us, that we hang on to, that we use to define ourselves and others. It's letting go of those and allowing God's love and grace to fill that space. But this love which he talks and lives is risky. It's risky for you and I, because love means we can get hurt. Love means being vulnerable, giving ourselves to another person, whether it's intimately in a partnership, in a marriage, whether it's having children and giving ourselves to these children who are vulnerable and offering ourselves, loving another and risking loving and friendship and loving and being with others, risking going into the places where there's poor and vulnerable people and being rejected along with them. Because the way of love is not the way that the world operates. The way in which the world operates is like those superheroes. It's about power and might and strength. It's about being stronger, being more clever, having more at our disposal, being able to use it against others. That's not the way of Jesus in the world. God's way is different. And Jesus invites us into this way of love. Mark's writing to people who are followers of Jesus, saying the way is not about violence. The way is about love. It's not about gaining more power and might to take these people on. It's about letting go and trusting God. It's about building relationships. It's about reaching out to those who are different and including them, breaking down barriers and helping all people find life. And that's a risk. It's a risk that we need to take. It's a risk in our world because there is too much power, there's too much violence. There's violence in homes, there's violence in communities, there's violence between nations. And it doesn't bring solutions. It just brings more hatred and pain, more fear. The way of Jesus is about letting go and allowing love to flourish. The love of God that brings healing and life to the world. That's what Mark wants us to see. Will we let go? Amen.
Mm-hmm.